Sew your pieces right sides together with 1/2 inch or 13mm seam allowance. Press your seam allowances open. Fold one side of your seam allowance under 1/4 inch or 6mm and press. It may be easiest to do this step with your pieces laying on top of each other and the seam allowance along the side, rather than keeping your piece flat and the seam allowances open. You are bringing the raw edge of your seam allowance to just inside your stitch line and folding it in place along the length of your seam. Repeat this on both sides of your seam. Press the folded underside of your seam allowance away from your stitch line, resulting in completely enclosing the raw edge of one side of your seam allowance. Here you can see I'm basically doing them at the same time by pressing my seam allowance open again, but keeping the folded edge folded under. If you wish to use top stitching thread to accentuate the stitch detailing, baste your folded under seam allowance in place first. Set your stitch length to a 4 or 5mm length. Otherwise, you can just stitch with a standard stitch length that you've been using for the rest of the piece. With your pieces open flat, sew along the folded underside of your seam allowance with an edge stitch. This will result in a stitch line on the outside of your garment 1/4 inch or 6mm away from the seam. If you wish to use top stitching thread to accentuate the stitch detailing, set your stitch length to a top stitching length of about 3mm. Then, with top stitching thread, sew from the right side of your garment on top of your basting stitch line. You can remove your basting stitches afterwards. Make sure to repeat all the steps for each side of your seam allowance. This will result in 2 stitch lines on the outside of your garment, each 1/4 inch or 6mm away from either side of the seam. Give your final seam a press. A clean finish should result in looking really nice and neat from the outside and the inside.